The movie begins by introducing us to a 14-year-old boy named Calvin who lives in an orphanage in Los Angeles. Right now, he's outside playing basketball with his best friends, Murph and Reg. While they're playing, a group of bullies approaches them, led by a boy named Ox. Ox starts teasing Calvin about his height, saying he's too short and weak to ever become a basketball player. To prove himself, Calvin agrees to a one-on-one basketball game against Ox, even though he has nothing to gain and a lot to lose. Ox tells Calvin that if he wins, Calvin has to give up his favorite jersey. Calvin believes his pride is on the line, so he's willing to take the risk. However, because of Ox's size advantage, he easily beats Calvin. Ox humiliates him further by tearing Calvin's jersey in front of everyone. Calvin is clearly hurt by this, but he stays strong and confidently says that someday he'll have a family that will buy him 5 new jerseys. Just then, the orphanage director, Biddleman, who is a corrupt and greedy man, arrives and forces the kids to sell candy at night to raise money. The kids have no choice but to obey, so they end up outside a crowded basketball stadium trying to sell candy to passing strangers. Try for hours, but no one buys anything. Eventually, Calvin meets a man named Coach Wagner, who is the head coach of Calvin's favorite team, the Los Angeles Knights. Calvin is thrilled and expresses how much he admires the team. He tells Coach Wagner that he's selling candy to help raise money for the orphanage. Wagner, touched by Calvin's enthusiasm, gives him $20. Calvin, however, refuses to charge him, explaining that he respects him too much to take his money. He also admits he's unsure if the money really goes toward the orphanage. Wagner is impressed by Calvin's honesty and gives him 4 tickets to the Knights' next game, making Calvin incredibly happy. So the next day, some couples visit the orphanage looking to adopt a child. Unfortunately, none of them seem interested in Calvin or his friends because they're older kids. So this saddens Calvin, but his mood brightens when a nun brings in a box of donated items for the orphanage. Inside, he finds an old pair of basketball sneakers, and the nun mentions they once belonged to a famous bald basketball player. Calvin notices the initials MJ on the shoes and gets excited, thinking they might belong to Michael Jordan. But his excitement doesn't last long. Ox and his gang of bullies come back and try to take the sneakers. Calvin refuses to give them up, but the bullies overpower him and throw the shoes up onto a power line, leaving Calvin feeling defeated. At night, as heavy rain pours down, Calvin wakes up Murph and Reg, asking for their help to retrieve the shoes. They head outside, and Calvin climbs a tree to reach the sneakers. Just as he grabs them, a bolt of lightning strikes the power line, knocking him to the ground. Luckily, Calvin isn't hurt. When he puts on the shoes, though, a strange surge of electricity runs through them. So the next day, Calvin and his friends are thrilled to go to the Knights game, using the tickets Coach Wagner gave them. They even give a ticket to Ox to keep him quiet so he won't tell Biddleman about their plans. So once the game starts, the Knights play terribly, which disappoints Calvin. During halftime, the team's manager, Frank, announces that one lucky fan will get the chance to play one-on-one with Tracy, the Knights' star player. When they call out the winner's ticket number, it turns out to be Calvin's. Excited, Calvin heads down to the court and entertains the audience with his funny moves. Before the game starts, he ties his sneakers and quietly wishes he could play like Michael Jordan. When the game begins, Calvin shocks everyone by easily beating Tracy. This frustrates Tracy, who tries to play more seriously, but Calvin keeps scoring, even managing a 30-foot shot in a slam dunk. The crowd goes silent, stunned by what they're seeing, then breaks into loud applause. So meanwhile, Calvin is thrilled with the news and can't wait to share it with Murph and Reg. His friends are shocked by his amazing performance, and Calvin admits that it might be because of his special sneakers. He asks them to keep it a secret, not realizing that Ox is eavesdropping on their conversation. In the next scene, Calvin arrives at a big game and is excited to share a locker room with the players he has admired for so long. He approaches Tracy, apologizing for beating him in their last match, but the pro player assures him it's all good. So then Calvin talks to the coach, asking him why he's really allowed to play. To his disappointment, Wagner admits that Calvin was hired by Frank not to play seriously, but just to entertain the crowd. The game starts, and the Knights are playing poorly again. Calvin suggests some new strategies to the coach and asks to take the lead. Although the other players are skeptical, Wagner decides to give Calvin a chance. Calvin puts on his magical sneakers and plays like a pro, helping the team make a huge comeback with 27 points, leading the Knights to victory. After the game, Calvin's performance goes viral in sports news, and he officially signs with the Knights as a pro player. A few days later, Calvin takes his first trip with the team on a private jet, an experience beyond his wildest dreams. On the flight, Wagner asks Tracy to be Calvin's roommate and help guide him. Later, they arrive at a fancy hotel, and Calvin, thrilled by his new lifestyle, jumps around the room with excitement. That night, he prays for his friends back at the orphanage and says some kind words about Tracy. Touched, Tracy opens up to Calvin, revealing that he lost his family years ago. In the following days, Calvin continues to help his team win game after game, becoming a big star. He and Tracy form a close friendship, often spending time at Tracy's place when they're not playing. In the next scene, Calvin goes back to the orphanage, bringing gifts for his friends. Later, while they're chatting, he shares with Murph how much he's enjoying his new fame. Ox, however, overhears them and is filled with jealousy. He sneaks over to Calvin's bed that night, trying to steal his magic sneakers. Murph tries to protect his friend, but the bullies hold him back. Hearing the noise, Biddleman enters the room and warns the bullies not to harm Calvin, saying he's very valuable to him. Ox angrily reveals that Calvin's winning streak is due to his magic sneakers, but Biddleman dismisses him and tells him to go to bed. A few days later, Calvin learns from another player that Tracy actually has a father, but they don't speak to each other anymore. This makes Calvin sad sad because he'd do anything to have a father figure. He tries talking to Tracy about it, but Tracy, not ready to discuss his family issues, tells him to stay out of it. As Calvin's popularity grows, more couples start visiting the orphanage, hoping to adopt him. He meets a few potential parents, but none of them feel right. One day, Calvin surprises Tracy by showing up at his house and excitedly announces he has a surprise for him. Tracy assumes it's something fun, but it turns out to be his estranged father. Angry, Tracy throws his dad out of the house and scolds Calvin for interfering in his personal life. Heartbroken, Calvin returns to the orphanage, where he meets a new potential family, the Boyds. So they're a kind and caring couple, and Calvin feels hopeful about them, thinking they could be his family. But this upsets Biddleman, who won't make any money if Calvin gets adopted. So he finds Ox and asks him to explain what he said about the sneakers. Ox tries to dodge the question, but Biddleman pushes him until he spills the truth about the sneakers. Hearing this, Biddleman devises a new, crooked plan. Biddleman buys Calvin a new pair of shoes, insisting that he wear them to lunch with the Boyds. Calvin hesitates, preferring his old sneakers, but Biddleman insists, saying it's important to look his best. Calvin finally agrees, but he asks Murph to guard his magic sneakers while he's out. Later, Murph is alone, looking at a photo of his late mother, when Ox and Biddleman enter the room. So they demand that Murph hand over Calvin's sneakers. Murph refuses, but Biddleman then threatens to burn his mother's photo and even sets a flame to it, forcing Murph to reveal that the sneakers are hidden in the attic. Meanwhile, Calvin is trying his best to impress the Boyds over lunch, hoping they will see him as a good fit for their family. In another scene, Biddleman meets with some shady bookies and tells them he plans to bet $100,000 against Calvin's team, the Knights, in the next game. The bookies are surprised, as the Knights have been playing well, but Biddleman assures them that Calvin will not perform his best this time. Elsewhere, Tracy, Calvin's favorite player, has reconciled with his estranged father, mending their broken relationship. Before the next big game, Tracy meets with Calvin to share some big news. He wants to adopt Calvin and finally give him the family he's always wished for. Calvin is thrilled, but just then the Boyds enter the locker room and Calvin introduces them as his soon-to-be adoptive parents. Although Tracy is a bit taken aback, he congratulates Calvin and wishes him luck in the game. With only 20 minutes before the game, Murph feels guilty and decides to tell Calvin the truth about what happened to his sneakers. Calvin is shocked, realizing he'll be just an ordinary player without them. He rushes back to the orphanage to retrieve them. As the game is about to start, the team frantically searches for Calvin, but he's nowhere in sight. At the orphanage, Calvin finds Biddleman happily watching the game on TV, anticipating his big win. Calvin and the other children decide to team up against him and manage to tie him to a chair, so they demand he reveal the combination to his safe, where he's hidden the sneakers, but Biddleman refuses. Just then, Ox enters the room, and Biddleman hopes Ox will help him. Instead, Calvin talks to Ox, explaining that despite their differences, they are all part of the same orphanage family and should support one another. Touched by Calvin's words, Ox decides to do the right thing. He helps Calvin by retrieving the sneakers from the safe, since he knew the combination all along. With the sneakers in hand, Calvin and his friends speed toward the game on their scooters, determined to make it in time. Biddleman finally manages to free himself and urgently calls the bookies, asking them to stop Calvin from reaching the game. The bookies agree, determined to catch the boy and prevent any loss of their money. Despite this, Calvin, with the help of his friends, skillfully avoids his pursuers and escapes. So when he arrives outside the arena, Biddleman confronts him, demanding that he hand over the sneakers. Calvin quickly hits Biddleman with his scooter, dashes into the court, and gets ready to play. So inside the arena, the Knights are struggling against their opponents, who are dominating the game. It's a crucial match, and if the Knights lose, they won't make it to the playoffs. When Calvin shows up, Coach Wagner is furious and initially refuses to let him play. However, the team encourages the coach to forgive him, and Calvin is allowed back onto the court. Calvin scores a series of points, helping the Knights make an incredible comeback. Just when it seems victory is in sight, Calvin's magical sneakers suddenly repart. During the break, Calvin is filled with worry about letting his team down. He confides in Tracy, explaining that his sneakers are what gave him his incredible skill. Tracy doesn't believe in the magic, but instead tells Calvin to trust his natural talent. Encouraged, Tracy gives him a regular pair of shoes and sends him back to the game. Before stepping back on the court, Calvin tells his teammates that this will be his last game, as he wants to go back to being a regular kid. The team is shocked, but they respect his decision and play on. Without his magical sneakers, Calvin starts to struggle, with his shots repeatedly blocked by the opposing players. In the final moments of the game, with the score tied, Calvin comes up with a clever strategy. He pretends to take a shot, causing his defender to jump. Then, he passes the ball to Tracy, who makes a perfect shot, securing the Knights' comeback win and their place in the playoffs. After the game, Calvin's new adoptive parents invite him out to celebrate, but as they sit together, he realizes he doesn't feel at home with them. Apologetically, he chooses to return to the orphanage. Days later, the Knights team visits the orphanage, and Calvin learns that they are now the sponsors of his home. Biddleman has mysteriously vanished, likely due to his debt troubles after the match. Later, Tracy has a heartfelt talk with Calvin, expressing his wish to adopt him. Calvin is thrilled but spots Murph in the distance and feels torn. He tells Tracy that he will only go if Murph can come too, as he doesn't want to leave his best friend behind. Tracy happily agrees, welcoming Murph into his new family as well. In the final scene, we see Calvin, Murph, and Tracy together at home, enjoying their time as a new family. Calvin's dream of having a loving family has finally come true, and it means more to him than any fame in basketball. We also see pictures of Reg, who has been adopted too, finding her own family in a happy home. Subscribe for popcorn. We are racing towards 2,000 subscribers.